Hello, my friends. I'm George Kors, and today we're talking about the philosophy of translation by relatively famous translator Damion Searls. This is a brand new work by Searls. Well, brand new 2024. I'm recording this in 2025. And lots to talk about with regard to translation here. Before we deep dive into Mr. Searls here, if you like my videos and you want to support me, please buy my work. Sing Lazarus, my newest novel, is out now. Link is down below for that. You can buy my debut, Always the Wanderer. Anything you do regarding these works, buying them, talking about them, reviewing them in various places, helps me and supports the channel. Thank you very much to everybody who's doing so. Let's talk about Damion Searls and the philosophy of translation. Now, this work came out in 2024, Yale University Press, and it's I think for the let's say emerging popularity of translated works amongst readers in the United States and the United Kingdom. I don't know as much about Australia to speak about Australia. Um, but the popularity of translated works in the United States is increasing somewhat. And Mr. Searls, Damion Searls, is a relatively famous translator. This work, The Philosophy of Translation, clocks in at 225 pages. So it's not a huge tome per se, but Searles himself is probably one of the more sort of contemporary beloved translators out there. Translated Jahrestage by Uwe Jonsson, which I have here in the original German to show off for you guys. Translated all of these 4 volumes into 2 in the English. I have a video on the first 2 volumes down below that you can take a look at. And Jahrestage does serve as a major example in here. I think probably the most famous that I see on socials, probably of Searles translations, is probably John Fosse's Septology, which I have not read. Um, in fact, this work, The Philosophy of Translation, is the only thing of Searles that I've read. I've never read any of his translations because I don't read German in the English. I read German in the German. So, to that extent, I was excited to sort of delve into this and think a little bit, from my own sort of writerly perspective about translation and to sort of see, what Searles, who is relatively prolific in this moment, is thinking and writing. And it's a title like The Philosophy of Translation intrigued me quite a bit. That was something that I was enticed by, to be sure. And I would say, to start things off here, um, because of the nature of this work, I think I wanted to talk a little bit first about sort of a culture of translators in the United States. And I did not know this, but fairly early on here in this work, Searles admits to um, being guided through the early stages of his career as a translator by the absolutely famous and perhaps one of the most important translators of the last 100 years, Edith Grossman. And I say translators into the English. You might know Edith Grossman from translating a little novel called Don Quixote into a fresh, new translation from the Spanish into the English. And a connection like Edith Grossman is enormous. What a astounding privilege for Mr. Searles to have that connection. And That got me thinking a little bit about this culture of translators and the sort of in-group, out-group that we might see with translators as they, probably professionally know one another relatively well. Um, there's a little aside in here that isn't explored a ton in the work and isn't commented on very much in the sort of overarching philosophy that Searles is presenting here. But I need to read it to you because it has to do with this culture of translators, and it is eye-opening, and I think probably is for me was a moment of great concern. Um, This is on page 39, if you guys have a copy of this work, but it's in the footnote 17 here. In 2021, an international group of translators from German, including me, was told by more than one publisher in Berlin that translation into English is now overwhelmingly the gatekeeper for foreign translations in general. A foreign book's rights might sell to 5 or 6 languages, not including English, but would never sell to 20 or 25 except for on the back of the English. And this, even though it's not a major explored theme in Searls' work here, this footnote stood out to me as such an interesting inside view. Understanding that Searls knew Edith Grossman, one of the most impactful translators in the United States, and to have Searls admit this, that the major publishers are really only interested, major German publishers are only interested in something that's been translated into English. They aren't interested in its merits. They aren't interested in its artistic worth or its historical context or its ideas. They are interested in it having sold in the United States, the United Kingdom. Floored me. And to start off by talking about a culture of translation, I had to read this to you. I had to. It was, I was just absolutely compelled because it was, very, very interesting, especially in a literary culture where there is so much alleged concern about, we don't publish like we used to, in so many different directions. And what Searls is admitting with that is this greater U.S. American and to an extent English hegemony in the publishing space. So if you're reading in English and you're reading a translation, your reading of a translation is allegedly to the publishers in Germany more important, than something that hasn't been translated in English but has been translated into Polish instead. I guess this should come as no surprise in sort of the cynical capitalist world that we live in. And this is something that should not, be a terrible shock to all of us. But to, see Searls be candid about a couple of these things was really interesting to me. And was frankly a little distracting from the philosophy that Searls soon delves into, which I'll get into here in a moment. It's very, very interesting to think through that and to think through all the individuals who are doing a lot of work, a lot of comparative languages work across languages, who are trying to, whether it be bring novels or poetry or works of philosophy or what have you, works of theater or so on and so forth, across languages and bring an understanding there, to have this understanding of, Mr. Searls knew one of the most famous translators in the United States, and then also is being told, like, hey, by the way, those translations into English are far more important than the translations into pretty much any other language for the industry. It was eye-opening, and affirming in a lot of different ways, and not to be cynical, but it was interesting. And that, is a very interesting first impression to bring to a book of philosophy. Continuing on, that is pretty largely unexplored, that culture of translators and with relation to the publishing industry is relatively unexplored throughout the rest of the work. So don't come to Searls looking for commentary on hegemony or power per se. I think that's probably elsewhere. I think there are probably other scholars and writers sort of unpacking that. What is, I guess, going on in Searls' world of the philosophy of translation is a little bit of unpacking with regards to some perhaps cliched questions that we ask about translation. Questions like, is a translation good? The value judgment, or is a translation faithful? And then to a large extent, in addition to these questions being questioned, Searles is also looking at how we translate, and specifically, to his mind, what is the path to a tenable translation and what constitutes the action of translation. Um, and I think early on, once we get past, a little bit of scene setting here, um, we're introduced to some of Searles' thinking about phenomenology, about the strange. What is that strange sort of aspect in a text or a work or in a language? How is that translated? Um, and then Searles starts to get more and more granular about the various acts that go into translation and what, to his mind, those acts are and what some of the sort of underpinnings are there. Um, for me, I would say Searles did a relatively interesting job of introducing a pretty wide range of sources. Searles is absolutely pretty well versed in the German thought tradition. What I mean by that is, the various 18th and 19th century philosophers and thinkers, and not exclusively philosophers, but also folks like philologists and other thinkers who were considering something like language and by proxy to that, translation. Um, if you're looking for maybe a more nuanced list of, hey, who can I read that might be in that vein, if you're looking to be in that more continental philosophical sphere, I think that Searles' The Philosophy of Translation is a relatively good introduction to a pretty wide range of sources, and to that end can be a useful jumping off point for you if you are wanting to get into a little bit more of that philology, continental or German, tradition of thought mode when it comes to thinking through language and when it comes to thinking through what language is and what definition is and what meaning is. Um, I think Searles did a relatively good job at that, and you can tell that Searles really is passionate about all of this and really does care. It's not just that he met Edie Grossman, as he refers to her, and got hooked up with everybody. It's that he actually does, he has skin in the game, of course, for being a translator, but also he feels a passion, and we can sort of see that in the text. And I thought that was pretty well done. Um, One of the other things that I think is really interesting about this, this work is Searles using his own examples of translation and justifying those examples. And I picked up and showed my copy of the 4-volume novel by Uwe Janssen, Jahrestage, Anniversaries, which Searles was the first person to translate in its entirety into English. And this, these 4 novels are an incredibly difficult work to grapple with, not just as a translator, but as a reader. And in the original, one of the things that I find most fascinating, I'll just hold one up instead of 4 of them. One of the things I find most fascinating about Jahrestage and Janssen's, stylistic use of language throughout the 4-volume novel is his use of dialect and his use of different languages and modes and registers. Um, and as a novelist myself, I hats off to Mr. Janssen, truly a great writer. But that to me is a very difficult skill for any writer to use. Being able to use dialect, being able to use dialect well, being able to use dialect in a way that is genuine, that reads interestingly, I think is really profoundly difficult, and is maybe one of the reasons why a lot of writers steer clear from it. Johnson does an incredible job, and the Plattdeutsch that is throughout here is essential to the progression of the novel. Um, and looking at a translator like Searls, who's translating for some of the more prestigious publishers, in the United States, seeing him justify those different examples and give out those thinking was interesting to me, whether or not I agreed with the way that he translated them or not. And there were plenty of examples in the philosophy of translation where where he either had side by side the original German and the English, or I pulled up the German out of this, my own copy, and scrutinized it and thought about his thinking. But what's important to me here is seeing Searles using his own thinking and sticking to his methodology. That's really, really interesting. And if that's something, if that sounds interesting to you, I think the philosophy of translation would be a really great work to delve into, because to that extent, the philosophy of translation is a little bit more of a memoir. There's a lot of his philosophical thinking and philosophizing, to be sure, especially when it comes to him referencing the various philosophical and philological works that he holds dear and relies on to think through his, work as a translator. But, time and time again, we see his examples, and we see sort of examples of him, just like I read about him, being told this by the German publishers. We see his own experiences as a translator. So to that end, there's an element of memoir in here, and that element of memoir is pretty prolific throughout it, especially with how he uses his own examples, because it's sort of I did this because, and I won't claim to know, if there's a lot of professional controversy about Searles and if his translations have been thrown into question or not, because I don't know that. But there is, a little bit of that justification of his work that goes throughout it. There's definitely examples from septology, for example, and as I said, ample examples from Uwe Janssen. Some of his ideas, focusing more on the sort of philosophizing aspect of the philosophy of translation, pardon me, focusing a little bit more on that action. Some of his ideas are important for readers to think about, and if you haven't taken, work in, formal linguistics or formal logic, it may not be something that you're really exposed to. And there is a section on translating force, which is really interesting to me. And he talks about, if an arrow is shot through the sky, do we translate its arc or do we translate the arrow? And that's a really interesting question, because the arc, its movement from one place to another, certainly is an essential part of understanding the arrow, and then understanding the arrow itself, the object that moves. This is splitting hairs, and I think some folks might find this pedantic to talk about language like this. But this is really, the meat and potatoes of the issue of translation. I think it's really, really interesting. Searles even goes on to posit, what we're translating for, as in, like, what are we aiming to translate when we take one thing and we move that thing into another language. And by the way, that verb there, move, Searles has a lot to talk about with what verb we're using to describe the act of rendering one text into another language. And Searles is not the first person I've heard talk about the violent connotation with target language. Target is a thing you shoot, so that's got this violent connotation to it. Searles does posit 4 things to translate for: sound, register, association, and movement. I'll leave those for you to go interact with. I found those 4 aspects to translate for rather interesting. There was a lot going on there. There's a little bit of vagary with each of them, particularly with movement, I think might be a touch vague for me. I was hoping for a little bit more granularity there, but I I felt where Searles was coming from and sort of what he was trying to unpack. Um, One of the major questions here that I would say, and how to even answer this is, what is a faithful translation? And this is something, it's an epistemological question that I think draws on a lot of our personal philosophies and what meaning means to us and what knowing means to us. Um, Searles definitely is interested in poking at that question a little bit, and he even says on let's see here, I think it's on page 194. Um, you know, he says all translators are faithful, but to different things, to whatever they feel is most important to preserve. And this is Searles sort of backing off and not. I sort of got the feeling in that moment he didn't want to necessarily overly commit himself to saying what the goal of translation is. And there's a lot of academic and philosophical debate about this, about what it is we're translating for, and what it means to be faithful. I'm going to drop a resource down below that talks about translating in a bilingual capacity. And I think that concept came to me in an article about Abdul Rahman Munif's Cities of Salt, that was called Culture or Conflict of Culture and Translation. And this idea of being bicultural or bilingual and bicultural. And that's something that, Searles doesn't explore really at all in here. And I think that there is definitely a case to be made where um, we're translating for cultural experience as well as for linguistic output. And that there's a lot of conflict there. I'm going to put the citation for that article down below. You can go poke around in that. Um, and basically what the writers of that, Alidmat and Manjet, I believe, are their names. I'm sorry if I got them wrong. But basically, what they're focusing on is, a alleged mistranslations um, of Peter Theroux, who translated Munif's Cities of Salt from the Arabic into the English. And they bring up and point out a lot of different, issues there that are cultural issues in the translation. Um, and that's not something that Searles explores really at all in his philosophy of translation. And I was a little surprised by that, to be honest, especially considering that Searles does translate from a lot of languages into English. And that's something that I've seen, you know, is relatively popular amongst a certain set of contemporary translators, that there are, individuals who are translating from not just one or two or three, but 5 or 6 languages into the English. And that is really, that raises some more of those questions of like, what is this quality of faithfulness? And the cultural aspect there, that Alidmat and Manjet talk about with regard to Cities of Salt, is something I'd love to hear Searles talk about. I'd love to hear a translator who translates many languages talk about that. And I think there's something for me as a user of language and as a writer where I would split hairs here a little bit, where I would say that it's reasonable for a person to be a polyglot. That is, a person who is able to speak, read, write multiple languages, 3 or more, right? I don't think that's necessarily unusual historically or globally. I think that's actually a lot more common than a lot of individuals maybe would think. I think that to be a polyglot is relatively, that's reasonable to me because an experience of language, how you read in a language, how you speak in a language, where you speak it, so on and so forth, so contextual, so cultural that there's a lot going on there. To be a translator of many languages might be a different threshold for me. That might be a more difficult threshold for me. And there's also, I would say an issue here of text versus speech. Because if we're to take, if we're to look at Mr. Searls, who at certain points in the philosophy of translation does say like, hey, I may not know a language very well, but I know if I like a text in it. And he can go on to translate that. You know, there's a difference between translating a page of text versus translating a speech in the moment, translating a conversation in the moment, for example. And that I think is something I would like to see a little bit more discussion of by Searles, and that bicultural notion that Alidmat and Manjet talk about too. I would like to see a little bit of discussion there in here, and there's not, and that's okay. But I think that discussion of what is a faithful translation is more than just a discussion of philology or language or linguistics. To talk about what is going on here, it is a deeply cultural thing, and to Searle's defense, he does sort of hint at some of these cultural things in there. It's just not necessarily explicitly talked about. And that brings me to, um, you know, some of what I'd like to talk about in terms of translation in general, and some of the things outside of Searles that have influenced my understanding and thinking about language and translation. Um, I don't have recommendations for you necessarily, as much as I have, a couple of things to consider. If you're interested in kind of exploring what translation means to you or to us or to whomever more. And the first thing I have to point to is, um, this old symbolic logic workbook that I had in undergrad. It was my professor's hand copied notes. Um, and if we look at symbolic logic, if we look through, examples of L for P and Q, if we're looking at this sort of formal symbolic logic, this is, at a really base level, representation of definition. This is working on definition. And um, one of I love the professor, shout out to Dr. Stephen Pollard, who writes in here, instead of assigning a definite English sentence to each of our sentence letters, as we just did in the case of P and Q, we might indicate whether or not a sentence is to stand for a true sentence or a false one. And if you were to, say, dive a little bit into symbolic logic, you might start thinking about some of these bivalent value judgments that we ascribe to language and then ascribe to translations. And my old professor is doing one right here, a true sentence or a false sentence. So we might look at, a translation and say, well, a faithful translation is a translation that's true, and a true translation is one that captures the force of the original in the new language. Well, we can work all of that out and have these definitions done in symbolic logic. The problem with symbolic logic is that it is a really reductive view of human language. It's extremely, extremely, if X then Y. And these formulas and how we use them, this does possibly miss some of what I was just talking about with regards to culture, but it also is probably going to miss things like the context, or if I'm interrupted speaking, or if there's a lot of social pressures, or if I'm tired, or I haven't had anything to eat today. These things also affect our translations and affect, of course, our language itself. So if you're really interested in starting to look at a little bit more seriously what's going on with regards to the beginnings of a look into formal semantics, I think looking at symbolic logic might be something fun for you. And if you're a STEM person out there, maybe this is your the bridge for you getting into the humanities a little bit. Because I think that might be a nice little connector there for you. Um, I know that this book is almost certainly out of date, but I learned formal semantics with this work, and I really appreciate the insights that it gave me, and that is Kate Kearns' work Semantics. Um, I really appreciated this work, back when I was studying a lot of linguistics, and to my taste, Kearns did a very good job of talking about the different kinds of semantic analysis that go into a work. And specifically when we're talking about formal semantics and linguistics, but formal semantics is a subfield of the field of linguistics. And we're talking about semantics, we're talking about the formal study of meaning. So I think, finding a work on semantics, I think might be a little bit more, of a serious, deep dive into what constitutes, felicitous meaning for you. And I think a basic intro text like this that undergrads use can be really illuminating when it comes to creating, or not creating, let's say, developing some ideas about, for you as a reader or for you as a language user, what constitutes a translation that you like. Let's say, let's remove good or bad. Let's say a translation that you like. So something to think about. I liked Kate Kearns. If you are a linguist out there who's teaching semantics, let me know how out of date this is. I'm sure that there's been ample work in the interim. This was first published in 2000, so it's pretty old at this point. And speaking of old, something that is in the sort of more philosophy of language side of things that I might recommend to you is How to Do Things with Words by J.L. Austin. This is a series of lectures about sort of the philosophy of language that I think is just really a really excellent introduction to semantics. And it is probably, a pretty foundational text for a lot of semanticists out there. These were all lectures given in the 1950s. And, Austin, to the extent that, when you get into Kate Kearns' work, there's just all these examples that you can go through. And, that's something that Searls does that's really excellent, is give these examples. And of course, any linguistics text is going to give you examples. They do a great job of that here. And I do appreciate that as well. Let me find, yeah, J.L. Austin's also giving a lot of examples for you to unpack and look through. And I like that. And that's something that's helpful for anybody who's grappling with this, because this is a heady topic. And I don't think you're going to get into, I don't think you're going to get into this and have fun with it or whatever if you're not a person who's really passionate about language. And this is not necessarily, the task here in, looking at something like How to Do Things with Words, or looking at Kate Kearns and semantics, or looking at just like, learning a little bit about symbolic logic, or, even reading Searls here. None of this is to necessarily disparage the monolingual reader. But instead it's to acknowledge that we actually live in a deeply multilingual world, even if you are, only speaking and reading in one language. even if you only speak and read in one language, what's happening with language is still important to you, because we're talking about the perceived quality of your translations from one word, from one language into another. And I think that that is something that Searls is really passionate about. Um, and I think is important for all of us to consider, no matter how many languages you speak. Perhaps you're a polyglot, perhaps not. Who cares? You're still interacting in a multilingual world. You will have no choice of that. And that is something that we just have to really think about. Um, if that is something that interests you, if that's something that you're excited about, and you want to learn more about what a really famous translator is thinking when he translates, I would say go for it. The Philosophy of Language by Damion Searls is a reasonable entry point there. And as I said up top, I think he's does a reasonable job of introducing you to various folks who might have even more granular and philosophical sort of statements to make about language and translation. If that's not enough for you, I think How to Do Things with Words, or a basic semantics text like Kearns, it's going to be excellent and will be really illuminating for how to think about language, because these are just modes of thinking, right? These are just modes that we put ourselves in to look at and consider the language that we're interacting with. And J.L. Austin or Kate Kearns, or your old philosophy professor who wrote out all of his notes on symbolic logic, can be a really interesting starting point there. And so too can Searls. I think to a large extent, the sort of memoir aspects of this here make it a lot less, at times, a lot less jargony and a little bit more personal. And to that end, I think it's really, really approachable. I would say this is much more approachable than my old, college professor's notes on symbolic logic, or How to Do Things with Words, or Kate Kearns. And there's a little bit of that sort of popular writing here. And I don't think, I wouldn't say that it's, I think, there might be the inclination for folks to say, oh, it's being dumbed down. I don't think that's true necessarily. But I think, it's just different audiences. And, Searls did write this a little bit, it's written a little bit for a more popular audience, to give a reader who probably does not have any experience translating anything a little bit of an understanding, philosophically speaking, about what his vision as a translator is for the philosophy of translation. So to that end, it's certainly compelling. If for folks out there who if you have an undergraduate or graduate degree in languages or translation or linguistics, or what have you, is the Philosophy of Translation a must read? Maybe not. Maybe not. But I think it's interesting, and I think it certainly is an important, let's say, historical document to the current moment, where U.S. Americans and English readers of English, are getting more into translations than they have previously. So to that extent, I think it is a worthy read. Is it, is this a, defining academic text? Probably not for me, but it, maybe it is for you. I don't know. Post down below what you think about that. I'd be curious to note. And I definitely, would be curious to see what people have to say about this. I think it really is interesting, especially considering the sort of anthropological view of translation amongst certain subgroups of readers in the English right now. The prevalence of certain publishers like New York Review of Books or Dalkey Archive Press, for example, which have a significant amount of prestige amongst a certain class of U.S. American readers, but also readers of the English sort of globally. If you log onto social media, and you start poking around in some of those literary circles, you're going to see that. This is a sort of formal document from one of the more famous translators amongst that cohort. And Searls also um, talks to other translators through this. I believe. Who is that? Who wrote? Who translated Zama? Let me see here. I don't know. Benedetti. Hold on one second. Hold on. I don't know where he is. Okay, well, um, I thought that I had a copy of Zama, which was written in the Spanish. There we go. Yes, here we go. Okay. Yes. He does, mentions and talks about Esther Allen, who is, a pretty well-renowned translator of the Spanish into the English. This is Zama, which I've recommended here before, by Antonio de Benedetto, who I believe is Argentine. But he talks about Esther Allen and others, and just as a cultural object of right now, I think maybe in the future, folks might point to a work like this to sort of think about where we are at in a literary sense right now. There is a little commentary on ChatGPT, the very end, just a little bit, not explored a ton. And I don't necessarily think it needed to be explored a ton, given this. It wasn't something I was missing, like a little bit of that, bicultural or multicultural sort of fluency that I was interested in. But that said, this is of the now. It was published in 2024. Definitely something, if you're a translation person out there, definitely something to consider, just to see, what popularly folks are talking about. And also, Searles got it published by Yale University Press. So there's enough prestige surrounding this that I think it merits a read, and certainly maybe worth your while. And maybe this is the work. Maybe this is it that gets you thinking a little bit more formally about language and linguistics, and hopefully so. I think the understanding of semantics is a really really excellent and worthy pursuit. And I think in a world of large language models, having a more nuanced view of semantics is a really essential tool in a practical day-to-day sense, because you're seeing, the sort of products of semantics out there being used in a wide range of capacities. I've lost the thread. I'm going to stop yammering on now. Let me know down below if you have read this, what your thoughts are about this. If you are if you're a translator, or if you are a, linguist or translation studies person or polyglot or whoever, sound off down below and just let me know what your thoughts are about this, because I'm really curious as to what others are thinking. And I would love to hear from you. I love to engage in that discourse. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me today. I hope you're reading translations. I hope that you're reading in other languages. That's my hope. Translation's a great start. I hope you're out there reading in the original, even if it's just a little bit. It can be such a rich experience to, appreciate literature in a language other than your own. And I hope that you are courageous enough to engage in that. You have my full support in doing so. If you like the channel, like I said up top, please buy my novel Sing Lazarus, buy my debut Always the Wanderer. That is the best way to support this channel by far. Talk about it with your friends, post about it on socials, review it, what have you. That makes a lot of a difference to me, and I thank you for that. Links to all that down below. You can follow me on socials. I may or may not use at GBK7288, probably only using Instagram at this point. You can find out more about me as a writer, thinker, and person at georgecoors.com. And I hope you're safe. I hope everything is okay with you wherever you are. I hope your reading journey is going well. And thank you for spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and thank you so much. Ciao.